Good afternoon. We are going to continue our story. I hope you're well, getting ready to go back to school. We're going to start this morning or this afternoon with our vocabulary. Number 1, revelers, people who are enjoying themselves in a lively and noisy way. 2, effigy, a sculpture or model of a person, a roughly made model of a particular person made in order to be damaged or destroyed as a protest or expression of anger. For example, the senator was burned in effigy. Number 3, riot, a violent disturbance of peace by a crowd, uncontrollable, rowdy behavior. Number 4, muffler, a scarf or wrap worn around the neck or face for warmth. 5, spit, a long, thin metal rod pushed through meat in order to hold and turn it while it is roasted over an open fire. Chicken cooked on a spit. 6, downy, covered with fine, soft hairs or feathers. As an example, the baby's downy cheek. 7, scuttle, a metal container with a sloping hinge lid and a handle used to fetch and store coal for a domestic fire. Okay, we are ready to continue with our story. The bells of St. Florian. Nan searched the area around the market for any sign of Charlie. Then she checked all of Marylebone and Westminster. She realized that Charlie would probably have rolled downhill, and so she traveled east into the street of her old life. The sun had long since set, and bonfire night was in full swing. The streets were now filled with masked revelers. This was one of only 2 days each year that the rich and the poor celebrated together. At nearly every corner, she saw crowds burning guys. Seeing the flaming effigies, she recalled her own experience in the seminary chimney. Suddenly, bonfire night didn't feel like a holiday at all. Nan passed a crowd gathered outside Mansion House, which was where the Lord Mayor lived. Men and women were shouting and waving torches, factory workers from the look of them. Labor riots like this seemed to be happening more and more in the city. Not that they changed anything. There was a crashing sound as someone threw a brick through one of the mansion windows. A whistle sounded, and the policemen broke into the crowd with batons. Nan kept her head down and rushed along Lombard Street. She didn't want to get caught up in the trouble. As Nan entered the East End, she put her Guy Fawkes mask over her head. Doubtless there were climbers about, someone who might recognize her. She checked the alleys, she checked the stoops, she checked every place she could think of, but there was no Charlie. "Charlie!" she called for the 100th time. Her voice was raspy from shouting. She cursed herself. If she had been paying more attention, if she hadn't strayed from the pram, Charlie would still be safe. She tried not to think about whether Charlie was hurt. She didn't even know if he could be hurt. She had seen him fall from some pretty great heights without complaining, and fire didn't burn him. She eyed the river. Bonfires along the south shore of the Thames reflected off its shifting surface. Could Charlie float? Bells across London struck 10 o'clock. She took a deep breath and tried to think like Charlie. If she were lost, where would she go? She thought of him in the morning. He was always up with the bells, staring out the window that faced east. Nan had assumed he was looking toward the sunrise, but maybe he was looking at something else. She remembered Charlie before he was Charlie, back when he was just a lump of soot. She thought of how some mornings he managed to escape her pocket and roll to the window in Crud's coal bin, as though something were drawing him in that direction. Nan turned up her collar and walked down Whitechapel Road toward her old home. She knew it was foolish. Even with a mask, any number of people might recognize her, including Crud. The November wind had turned brittle and cold. She balled her fists in her pocket and wished she still had the sweep's hat. She wondered what had happened to it after she escaped from the nudge. Perhaps it had burned in the fire. As she walked, she saw landmarks she had always known, the matchstick, the Tower of London, London Hospital. They all looked smaller than she remembered. Finally, Nan caught sight of St. Florian's, rising up from the hill in the east. The church steeple cast a shadow over Tower Hamlets. She moved slowly, keeping in shadow. Fireworks echoed off distant streets, lighting the sky overhead. Nan searched along the outer gates of the church. She took off her mask and called, "Charlie?" She saw something moving in the darkness. "Nan?" a voice said. Nan ran toward the voice. "I'm here." She found Charlie nestled beside one of the stone steps. "Is it really you?" His voice was so small. Nan collapsed to her knees and scooped him up in her arms. "I looked everywhere for you. You scared me half to death." She felt tears in her eyes. "You're shivering." "I was very frightened," he said, "but then I heard him." Nan wiped her eyes. "Heard who?" "He was singing," Charlie said. "He sang, and I followed his singing, and it led me here, and then you came." Nan looked up at St. Florian's Church, huge and square like a castle. Skeleton trees stretched up from the grounds beyond like grasping hands. Nan had never been this close to the church before. She was afraid of what she might find. "You mean you heard the bells?" she said. "No," Charlie shook himself back and forth. He was singing. He looked up at her. It was the sweep, not out loud, but I could hear him. Nan looked at Charlie, unsure how to answer. She took her muffler and wrapped it around him. She could feel his heartbeat racing against her own. "Come on," she said. "I'm taking you home." Nan did not say much until they were sitting safely on the captain's rooftop. Her mind was filled with questions she didn't know how to answer, questions she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answers to. "Charlie, what did you mean when you said you could hear the sweep?" Charlie was nestled in her lap. She could feel his flickering warmth. It warded off the autumn chill. "Sometimes I think I can hear him calling me," he shifted. "It feels like maybe he's trying to tell me something. Tonight I was very close, but I couldn't find him." He sounded disappointed in himself. Nan stared out at the endless rooftops. "It doesn't make any sense. Why would you be able to hear?" She didn't even know how to finish the question. Charlie seemed to understand what she was asking. "I think," he paused for a long moment, "I think there's something he wants me to tell you." Nan caught her breath. For 5 years, she had forced herself to believe that the sweep hadn't abandoned her, that he was coming back. And now Charlie was telling her he had a message. "What is it?" Her voice was shaking. "What does he want me to tell you? What does he want you to tell me?" Charlie turned to himself to look at her. I don't know." He lowered his eyes. "I am sorry." Nan sighed. "That's all right." She squeezed him. "I'm sorry for losing you." Charlie flinched as a firework popped somewhere close by. "It's fine," Nan said. "We're safe up here." A green rocket shrieked above the rooftops, illuminating the low clouds. It arced and fizzled and then scattered into flickering ash, drifting back into the dark streets below. "The sounds are painting the air," Charlie said. "I like fireworks much more from up here." Nan watched Charlie watching the display. "Me too." A silver light streaked up from afar and burst into 1,000 glittering stars that crackled and drifted down. "Nan?" Charlie's voice was small. "What is a monster?" He was recalling the word from the market. Even now, Nan could hear the screams of the crowd. "Monster is a word for something that frightens folks, like a creature of some kind." "Oh," he said, and then, "Am I a monster?" Nan hesitated a long moment before answering. She thought about Crud and Trundle and the cruel indifference of every person in the city who didn't care if she lived or died. "I've met monsters before," she said, resting her head atop his. "And you are not one of them." Kindness. The girl and her sweep had been walking between towns along the shore. The air had turned colder than it had any right to be at that time of year. There was a wind from the east, bitter and wet, pushing against their faces as they walked. The sweep carried the girl in his arms, just as he had when she was much smaller. That way she could keep her face turned from the wind. The howling was so loud that the sweep could not sing or speak to pass the time. The girl pressed her face against his neck, listening to his labored breaths as he trudged over the muddy path. She thought it sounded like the breathing of an old man. At last they came upon shelter. "Behold, a miracle!" the sweep cried, and he dropped the girl, nearly falling with her. It was an abandoned smithy shed, open on all sides. The tools were rusted and useless. The foundation crumbled. But in the middle, a furnace with a tall stone chimney. Even in this wind, a fire could be lit inside this furnace. The girl and her sweep got to their knees and cleared away the cobwebs. The girl noticed that the sweep's hands were shaking. They scraped the floor of the furnace until they had found enough bits of coal to burn. "Tonight we shall roast like a pair of plucked pheasants," the sweep said, rubbing his hands together. "We might as well put ourselves on spits," and he fell into a rattling cough that lasted too long. When he took his handkerchief from his mouth, it was stained black. The girl watched and wondered if he had swallowed a shadow. The girl removed a match from her pocket and, shielding it from the wind, struck it on the side of the furnace. The flame glowed warm against her skin. She lowered the match to the coals. "Wait," the sweep said. He grabbed her wrist. His hand was so cold. The sweep reached into the corner of the furnace and removed something small from the shadows. He held it up to the dying light of the match. It was a feather, small and downy. The girl looked at the feather, gripped tight between his thin fingers, fluttering in the wind. The match went out. "What does it mean?" the girl asked. The sweep crawled into the mouth of the furnace. He picked the girl up and put her on his shoulders, pushing her up into the stone flue. The girl saw something high in darkness, half lit by the moon. It was a nest, and nestled within it were 3 baby birds. They opened and shut their mouths, making the most pitiful cries. "Cheep, cheep, cheep." The girl was horrified. She had not heard the cries over the howling wind. She had almost burned the birds alive. She had dislodged her share of empty nests before and knew what to do. But when she reached up to clear the nest, the sweep told her to stop. He told her if they touched the nest, then the parent bird would abandon it and the babies would starve. He let the girl down from his shoulders. "It seems tonight we will have no fire." And then he lowered his head and said something she had never heard him say before. "I'm sorry." He scuttled the coals with his boot and picked up the girl and their brushes. She could feel his arm shivering as when wind howled around them. They continued walking into the night. And we will stop there. We'll see you tomorrow.